At this very moment, 4 human beings are falling through a 5,000-degree wall of fire. Inside the capsule integrity, the air is screaming with the sound of 1,000 jet engines. Outside, the friction is so violent it has turned the atmosphere into a sheath of ionized plasma. Heat intense enough to liquefy a solid steel beam in seconds. But there's a problem that the billions of people watching the live feed don't know. The heat shield, the only thing preventing these 4 astronauts from being vaporized, is fundamentally broken. NASA didn't just suspect it. They had the data. They had seen this exact shield disintegrate on its last flight. Yet behind the go for launch polls and the professional smiles, the agency made a choice that terrified its own top engineers. They were going to fly it anyway. They were betting the lives of Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen on a last-minute change in flight math. Today we're going inside the secret crisis of Artemis II, the mission where NASA ignored its own death toll warnings just to keep a schedule. To understand how we got to this moment of life or death, we have to look back at a ghost ship, Artemis I. In late 2022, the world watched as the first Orion capsule returned from the moon. It looked like a perfect success, but when recovery teams pulled the ship onto the deck of the USS Portland and flipped it over, the celebration stopped instantly. The heat shield looked like it had been hit by a shotgun blast. This shield is made of Avcoat, a 16-foot disc of resin and silica designed to char and melt away slowly, layer by layer. It's supposed to be a predictable, protective burn, but Orion's shield hadn't melted. It had fractured. Massive chunks of the material had literally detonated off the surface. There were over 100 locations where the shield had simply failed. Even more terrifying, NASA discovered that 3 out of the 4 massive separation bolts, the heavy-duty steel anchors holding the ship together, had partially melted. If those bolts had failed, the entire shield would have stripped off like a lid on a tin can. If there had been a crew inside, they would have been trailing a path of debris across the sky, one crack away from a catastrophic hull breach. NASA spent 2 years hunting for the ghost in the machine, using high-powered lasers and hypersonic wind tunnels to recreate the fire. What they found was a startling truth. A safety upgrade had turned the shield into a ticking pressure cooker. When a heat shield hits the atmosphere, it undergoes pyrolysis, essentially turning into gas. On the old Apollo missions, that gas escaped through tiny pores. It breathed. But the modern Artemis shield was too perfect. The outer char layer had sealed itself shut like a lid on a boiling pot. The gas had nowhere to go. It built up pressure deep inside the honeycomb structure until pop. The shield was literally blowing itself apart from the inside out. These were microscopic bombs, popping chunks of the protective layer off like blisters on sunburnt skin. But here is where it gets truly reckless. By the time NASA understood this, the Artemis II shield, the one with the crew, was already finished and bolted to the ship. Not only that, but this specific shield was actually denser and even less breathable than the one that just failed. NASA had made it that way on purpose to test the strength of the material, accidentally creating the perfect conditions for a disaster. They were stuck. Delay the mission by 3 years to rebuild the ship or roll the dice. NASA chose the gamble. They invented a new way to fall, the loft trajectory. Instead of skipping off the atmosphere to cool down, they would plunge straight through the fire. They believed that if they kept the shield white hot, the gas wouldn't have time to seal inside. They were fighting the fire by making the fire even more intense. But the warnings were chilling. Former astronaut Charles Camarda, a man who lived through the fallout of the Columbia disaster, went public. He calculated the risk of a fatal accident at 1 in 20. For context, NASA's own safety limit for losing a crew is 1 in 500. He warned that NASA was suffering from the normalization of deviance, the same institutional blindness that killed 14 people on Challenger and Columbia. He argued that NASA hadn't fully modeled how cracks might propagate under this brutal new path. He was telling the world that NASA was launching on a wing and a prayer. With the experts divided and the odds of survival sitting at a staggering 1 in 20, the mission's fate no longer rested on the engineers. It rested on the 4 people whose lives were actually on the line. Commander Reed Wiseman, a veteran astronaut and former chief of the astronaut office, told the press that he had sat in the engineering meetings, walked through every line of the math himself, and was satisfied with the risk. He famously said, "If we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned, then this heat shield will be safe to fly." On April 1st, 2026, at 6:35 in the evening, the Space Launch System rocket ignited on Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center. It was a historic moment, the first time in 53 years that humans had left low Earth orbit. For the next several days, the mission was a flawless triumph of human endeavor. The crew, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen, pushed further into the void than any humans had ever traveled, reaching a distance of 252,760 miles from their home planet. They surpassed the record held by the Apollo 13 crew by over 4,000 miles. They saw a solar eclipse from the far side of the moon, a black disk surrounded by an ethereal ring of fire. They named a small, distant lunar crater Carol in honor of Wiseman's late wife, a gesture that reminded the world that these people weren't just icons. They were fathers and mothers with everything to lose. But as they began their journey back toward the blue marble of Earth, the beauty of the mission faded into the high-stakes reality of the descent. None of the records or the photographs mattered if they couldn't get through the fire. On the evening of April 10th, the crew separated their module from the European-built service module. From that moment on, Orion was on its own. Everything now depended on physics and geometry. The angle of attack had to be within a tiny fraction of a degree. Too steep, and the G-forces would be high enough to cause internal bleeding or blackouts. Too shallow, and the ship would skip off the atmosphere like a rock off a frozen pond, sailing back into the void with no fuel left to return. At 400,000 feet, Orion crossed what is called the entry interface, traveling at 24,661 miles per hour. The atmosphere, which we usually think of as thin and soft, began to hit the capsule with the force of a concrete wall. The air molecules piling up against the shield couldn't move out of the way fast enough. They compressed, and in the physics of hypersonic flight, compression means heat. The capsule vanished inside a glowing sheath of ionized gas. Through the small, thick windows, the crew watched their world turn from the black of space to a blinding orange furnace. For the 6 minutes of the re-entry blackout, the state of the heat shield was a total mystery to everyone on the ground. The plasma surrounding the capsule wasn't just hot. It was electrically charged, creating a literal wall of static that blocked every radio frequency. At Mission Control in Houston, the silence was absolute. Flight Director Jeff Radigan and his team sat in front of their consoles, staring at empty data fields on their monitors. They knew that their colleagues were currently inside a burning vessel with a known defect. Nearly 4 times their body weight pressed the astronauts into their custom-molded seats. Breathing became a conscious, difficult struggle. You have to fight just to squeeze air into your lungs as the force of gravity tries to flatten your chest like a massive lead weight. Your vision narrows under that kind of pressure. Your arms feel like they weigh 40 pounds each. The capsule shakes with a violence that feels like it will tear the ship apart, rattling with a deafening roar that sounds like 1,000 jet engines. Through the windows, you see nothing but the orange and white fire of 5,000 degrees. There are no stars, no sky, no horizon, just the furnace. There is no escape system during re-entry. There is no abort button. There is no backup heat shield tucked away in a compartment. NASA builds redundancy into almost every system they fly. Redundant computers, redundant thrusters, redundant batteries. But you only get one heat shield. It either works or it doesn't. And for those 6 long minutes, nobody on Earth knew if those 4 people were still alive. The clock on the wall hit 7:58 p.m. 6 minutes had passed since the radio went dead. Suddenly, the static broke. A voice, clear and steady, filled the room in Houston. "Houston, Integrity. We have you loud and clear. It was Reed Wiseman. The shield had held. The gamble of the loft trajectory had worked. The continuous heating had kept the Avcoat permeable, the gases had vented safely, and the char layer had eroded predictably, just as it was designed to do half a century ago. The material hadn't cracked, it hadn't fractured, and it hadn't blown chunks of itself into the hypersonic wind. At 22,000 feet, the drogue parachutes deployed, ripping the speed of the capsule down from 500 miles per hour to roughly 300. At 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes, each the size of a professional football field, blossomed over the Pacific. Orion hit the water in a perfect bullseye splashdown off the coast of San Diego. Recovery teams in inflatable boats approached the capsule within minutes. One by one, the 4 astronauts climbed out of the hatch, having traveled nearly 700,000 miles to the moon and through a wall of fire to get back. Wiseman was the last to exit the ship. They had survived the most dangerous gamble in modern spaceflight. The agency will analyze that heat shield for years to come. They will tear it apart bit by bit to see exactly how much margin was left and how close it truly came to the edge of failure. Engineers will likely debate forever whether the mission succeeded because of the brilliance of the new loft flight path or because on that particular night they simply got lucky. But for 4 people falling through the fire that night, luck was enough. They reached the moon, they touched the fire, and against the odds, the name on the side of the ship meant exactly what it said. Integrity had been earned through a crucible of plasma and pressure. Somewhere on the moon, a small bright crater called Carroll remains as a silent monument to the journey they took. And back on Earth, the 4 human beings who named it were finally home.